All right. What's going on, everybody? Get ready to do a quick review of chapter 13 of the autobiography of Malcolm X as told to Alex Haley. Title of chapter 13 is Minister Malcolm X. Malcolm quit the job at the Ford Motor Company to help Mr. Muhammad spread his teachings to the quote 20 million black brothers who were brainwashed and sleeping in the cities of North America, end quote. Malcolm quickly became dedicated to the Nation of Islam. He says, quote, everything that happens Islam teaches is written, end quote. Malcolm was personally trained by Mr. Muhammad at his home for months. Malcolm says, quote, I was immersed in the worship rituals, and what he taught us were the true natures of men and women, the organizational and administrative procedures, the real meanings and interrelated meanings and uses of the Bible and the Quran, end quote. Malcolm viewed Elijah Muhammad as the symbolic lamb from Revelations. He says, quote, Mr. Muhammad's two-edged sword was his teachings, which cut back and forth to free the black man's mind from the white man, end quote. Malcolm worshipped Elijah like the power of the sun. Malcolm talks about the crimes committed by so-called Christian white men. He says, quote, not even in the Bible is there such a crime, end quote. Out of the 100 million taken from Africa, only 15 million survived. Malcolm says, quote, the dramatization of slavery never failed intensely to arouse Negroes hearing its horrors spelled out for the first time, end quote. Once Malcolm got people going on slavery, he would switch to something about the people. Malcolm taught how the white man was the devil. He says, quote, every time you see a white man, think about the devil you are seeing. They start to hold meetings at Brother Lloyd's house, and this is in Boston. He says he said that the meetings were starting to grow. After about 3 months, they were able to open a small temple. Malcolm was happy to tell Mr. Muhammad about their progress. Ella, his older sister, came to see Malcolm preach in Boston. Malcolm would end all of his meetings in the name of Allah and Elijah Muhammad. He says, quote, I believed Elijah Muhammad had been divinely sent to our people by Allah himself, end quote. Malcolm went back to Roxbury for the first time in 7 years. Roxbury, Boston. He tried to introduce Shorty to Islam, but Shorty loved pork and white women too much to join Islam. Malcolm briefly served as minister of Temple 11 until March 1954. He'd be 28 years old at that time. The messenger, Elijah Muhammad, moved him to Philadelphia. He organized a temple in Philadelphia in 3 months. He says that the brothers and sisters in Philadelphia were eager to learn the message of Elijah Muhammad. This was Temple number 12. In June of 1954, Malcolm is appointed as minister of Temple number 7 in New York City. New York's 5 boroughs provided the most potential to get the message of Islam to black people in America. Malcolm was back in Harlem for the first time in 9 years. The main 2 people he wanted to see was Sammy the Pimp and West Indian Archie. He found out that Sammy the Pimp had got killed and West Indian Archie was hard to find. Malcolm saw how the older hustlers weren't doing good anymore. He said, quote, I ran across close to 25 of these old-timers I had known pretty well who in the space of 9 years had been reduced to the ghetto's minor scavenger hustles to scratch up room rent and food money, end quote. Malcolm says he was, quote, thankful to Allah that he had become a Muslim and escaped their fate, end quote. Malcolm eventually found Archie. He says that he was sick in a Bronx rental room. He was, quote, sick in a weak way, end quote. Malcolm told Archie that Archie saved his life by running him out of Harlem. They talked about the $300 that caused them to try to kill each other. He says, Archie was glad to see Malcolm, and Malcolm gave Archie some money as he left. In 1954, Temple 7 was a small storefront. Malcolm says, quote, "Why, it's almost unbelievable that one bus could not have been filled with the Muslims in New York City," end quote. Most blacks at this time didn't even know what a Muslim was. Malcolm found it difficult to recruit members in Harlem. He says, quote, "With each meeting, my discomfort grew that in Harlem, choked with poor, ignorant black men suffering all of their evils that Islam could cure, every time I lectured my heart out, and then asked who wanted to follow Mr. Muhammad to stand, only 2 or 3 would," end quote. Malcolm became angry with his own ineffectiveness to recruit. He talks about having to compete with the, quote, "different nationalist groups, the Buy Black Forces, and others like that," end quote. Malcolm began to pass out leaflets to get the message out. He began to speak to people that were attending the nationalist meetings. Malcolm's most effective fishing audience were Christian churches. The Harlem organization would have their meetings right after church. Malcolm began to tailor his message to fish for Christians. He says they were, quote, "conditioned by the very shock I could give them about what had been happening to them while they were worshiping a blonde, blue-eyed God," end quote. He says that his passion would bring him to tears. He taught that Islam was a special religion for the black man. Blacks should not worship a white God, and how blacks wait for death to experience heaven. Malcolm learned to, quote, "always teach in terms that people could understand," end quote. But he still found it difficult to find followers of Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm says, quote, "I knew that our strict moral code and discipline was what repelled them most," end quote. Their code was no pork, no fornication, no alcohol, no tobacco, no narcotics, no dance, no gambling, and etc. The moral laws were policed by the fruit of the Islam, and suspensions were carried out by Mr. Muhammad. Temple number 7 grew slowly on Wednesdays. Malcolm traveled to Philadelphia to teach at Temple number 12. He helped start Temple 13 in Springfield, Massachusetts, and quickly established Temple 14 in Hartford, Connecticut. Mr. Muhammad would chastise Malcolm for his impatience in trying to create mosques so quickly. He says, quote, "No true leader burdened his followers with a greater load than what he would carry, and no true leader sets too fast a pace for his followers to keep up," end quote. Mr. Muhammad adds, quote, "I would rather have a mule I can depend upon than a racehorse I can't depend upon," end quote. The year was 1955. Malcolm's 30 years old. Malcolm helps to open Temple number 15 in Atlanta, Georgia. Malcolm tells the Atlanta audience that, quote, "We are here today with Mr. Muhammad's teachings, which resurrect the black man from the dead," end quote. Malcolm used a nearby funeral home to demonstrate the difference between mental and physical death. They didn't spend money on entertainment at funerals. He says, quote, we will now give his family any money we might have spent," end quote. Malcolm later learned that, quote, Mr. Muhammad's teachings about death in the Muslim funeral service was in drastic contradiction to what Muslims taught in the East, end quote. By 1956, the organization had done enough fishing in large cities like Detroit, Chicago, and New York to become sizable. This growth allowed them to recruit people with more education, and these people developed into ministers for Elijah Muhammad. In 1956, Mr. Muhammad got Malcolm a car. Malcolm says, quote, "The car was the nation's, not mine," end quote. He continues, quote, "In 5 months, I put about 3,000 miles of fishing," end quote. Malcolm stayed clear of the Muslim women, saying, quote, "My total commitment to Islam demanded having no interest, especially I felt no women," end quote. He felt he was too busy for marriage. Islam taught Malcolm that man's nature is to be strong and that women's nature is to be weak. It says, quote, "The true nature of a man is to be strong and a woman's true nature is to be weak. And while a man must at all times respect his woman, at the same time he needs to understand that he must control her if he expects to get her respect," end quote. Malcolm says, quote, "I couldn't have considered it possible for me to love any woman," end quote. Women were tricky, deceitful, and untrustworthy. That's what he thought. He says no. He could not risk having the wrong woman. He says, "quote for anyone in any kind of leadership position, such as I was, the worst thing in the world that he could have was the wrong woman." End quote. And he talks about Samson in the Bible and the relationship with Delilah and how she betrayed him in the Bible. He remembers talks with prostitutes and ministers and mistresses and says, quote, Mr. Muhammad himself encouraged Malcolm to stay single, end quote. Malcolm told the other brothers to be very, very careful with women. Malcolm met Sister Betty X in 1956. He said she was tall, brown skinned with brown eyes. She was a Detroit native and went to school in Tuskegee. She majored in education. Sister Betty lectured to the Muslim women about hygiene and medical facts. He talks about the Muslim events throughout the week, Sunday through Friday. One day, Malcolm takes Betty to the Museum of Natural History. He explains how Mr. Muhammad taught that the pig was a combination of three animals, a cat, a dog, and a rat. Malcolm would ask Betty questions to get to know how she thought. He was, quote, halfway impressed by her intelligence and also her education, end quote. Betty was one of the few women in the Nation of Islam with a college education. Malcolm was taught by Elijah Muhammad that the ideal characteristics for your mate, height, and age, Malcolm was taught by Elijah Muhammad what were the ideal characteristics for your mate in regards to height and age. Malcolm says, quote, Mr. Muhammad taught us that no marriage could succeed where the woman did not look up with respect to the man, end quote. The man's job was to provide psychological security, and that's something that came from above. Malcolm told Mr. Muhammad that he wanted to marry Betty, and at Malcolm's request, she is sent to meet Mr. Muhammad in Chicago. Malcolm says, quote, if you are thinking about doing a thing, you ought to make up your mind if you're going to do it or not, end quote. Malcolm went to visit his brother Wilfred in Detroit. Wilfred was made minister of Temple No. 1 in 1957. At this time, it's 1958, and Malcolm's 32 years old. When Malcolm got to Detroit, he called Betty and asked her directly, quote, look, you want to get married? End quote. Betty caught a plane to Detroit the next day, and they drove down to Indiana to get married. They were married on January 14th, 1958. Malcolm's 32 years old. They got married at the Justice of the Peace. He says, quote, I don't know how many marriage breakups are caused by these movies and television addicted women expecting some bouquets and kissing and hugging, end quote. Malcolm and Betty lived together for the next 2.5 years in Queens. From the beginning of 1958 to the summer of 1960. They shared a house with brother John Ali and his wife. Their first daughter, Attila, was born in November 1958. They later moved to a 7-bedroom home, and they had a second girl, Quibilla, was born Christmas 1960. Then Ilyasa, which is Arabic for Elijah, was born July 1962, and Amila was born in 1964. Malcolm says, quote, I guess by now I will say I love Betty, end quote. He says she's the only one I even thought about loving, end quote. Malcolm says that Betty was one of the 4 women he trusted in life. Based on what I read in the book, I would think that the other 3 women would be his mother, his older sister Ella, and his older sister Hilda. That's just my opinion. Malcolm says that Islam teaches men to look into women and for women to look into men. Betty understood Malcolm's responsibilities. He says, quote, awakening this brainwashed black man and telling this arrogant devil the truth about himself, Betty understands is a full-time job, end quote. Malcolm is only able to spend a little bit of time at home. He says, quote, I'm rarely at home more than half of any week. I had been away as much as 5 months, end quote. Betty reassured Malcolm while he traveled, telling him, quote, you are present with me when you are away, end quote. This is late 1958, and Malcolm's 33 years old. Malcolm was speaking at Boston as a guest when his older sister Ella decided to become a Muslim. The family had been trying to convert her for 5 years. They say some of the best Muslims were the ones that took a long time to convince. Malcolm then talks about an incident in Harlem. The cops had broken up a Negro fight, and a brother named John Hinton was a bystander who was attacked with nightsticks. His scalp was split open, and he was taken to the precinct. Muslims and the Negroes followed the police to the precinct. Malcolm went into the precinct and told them, quote, until he, John Hinton, was seen and we were sure he received proper medical attention, the Muslims would remain where they were, end quote. When Malcolm saw Brother Hinton, he was only semi-conscious. Brother Hinton was only semi-conscious. Malcolm says, quote, I hope I never again have to withstand seeing another case of sheer police brutality like that, end quote. Malcolm told the lieutenant that, quote, this man belongs in a hospital, end quote. The Muslims followed the ambulance for about 15 blocks. Malcolm says that Harlem blacks had never seen any organization of black men take a stand like the Muslims did. The high police official wanted to get the people to disperse. Malcolm told him, quote, our brothers are standing peacefully, disciplined perfectly, and harming no one, end quote. Malcolm told him that the undisciplined people were the police's problem. They dispersed once they were sure Brother Hinton was receiving the best care. Brother Hinton had to get a plate in his head, and he sued for $70,000, which was the most amount at that time. This incident gave a lot of attention to the Muslims by people in the police. By the people in the police. Malcolm ends with, quote, most important in Harlem, the world's most heavily populated black ghetto, the Amsterdam News made the whole story headline news. And for the first time, the black man, woman, and child in the streets was discussing, quote unquote, those Muslims. That's into chapter 13. Make sure you share this video if you like the information. Let me know if you disagree with anything that I said. Visit malcolmxfoundation.org if you'd like to make a donation. Read the book yourself. And thank you for watching. And I'll see y'all in chapter 14. Thank you.